Hi, everybody.
Hi.
What's up, Kate?
Hello.
Oh, you're recording. Good. Well, welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're going to be talking about defunding the police. So before we get into that stuff, we'll just do quick intros. For those of you who are new and joining us tonight, my name is Ann Lewis. I'm an activist artist based in Detroit. Yeah, I'm super stoked that everybody's here to kind of talk about this and see if we can help answer some questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eden. I use they or she pronouns. I'm also an activist and organizer based in Detroit and super happy to be talking about defunding the police.
Hey, my name is Kate DeCiccio. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm an Oakland-based artist and social organizer, and also here for defunding police.
So I thought we'd start tonight with just a little clip of Angela Davis talking to Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! If you don't watch Democracy Now!, you should check it out. It's amazing. She's amazing. And it's basically, Angela Davis has been in this fight for 50 years, literally. So she has some knowledge on the subject. So we thought, it'd be good to sort of open the discussion with that. And then we've got a really great graphic to sort of share and break down with y'all, and then we'll break out into questions and share some resources and stuff. So without further ado, I will share that video.
Angela Davis, you've long been a leader of the critical resistance movement, the abolition movement. And I'm wondering if you can explain the demand as you see it, what you feel needs to be done around defunding the police, and then around prison abolition.
Well, the call to defund the police is, I think, an abolitionist demand, but it reflects only one aspect of the process represented by the demand. Defunding the police is not simply about withdrawing funding for law enforcement and doing nothing else. And it appears as if this is the rather superficial understanding that has caused Biden to move in the direction he's moving in. It's about shifting public funds to new services and new institutions, mental health counselors who can respond to people who are in crisis without arms. It's about shifting funding to education, to housing, to recreation. All of these things help to create security and safety. It's about learning that safety, safeguarded by violence, is not really safety. And I would say that abolition is not primarily a negative strategy. It's not primarily about dismantling, getting rid of, but it's about re-envisioning. It's about building anew. And I would argue that abolition is a feminist strategy, and one sees in these abolitionist demands that are emerging the pivotal influence of feminist theories and practices.
I'd stop in there just because she goes into this really amazing thing about feminism, but it doesn't really talk about defunding the police. So you can find it. I can link to the rest of the talk on that, because her discussions on feminism are worth watching. But I didn't know if Eden or Kate, if either of you guys have that graphic that we can pull up. I have it on my phone, but I don't have it. Maybe I have it in my email.
Yeah, I can screen share. I have
okay,
it.
perfect.
Yeah. There we go.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, I don't know if we want to kind of go down these one by one. I think a lot of, what we're talking about isn't reform, it's more about abolition and defunding, but I think, this kind of breaks down both. I don't know, do either of you guys want to sort of take a stab at any of these?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this because I really found this to be very helpful in my understanding of reform versus abolition. And I think that let me show the full screen for everybody first. We have reforms, and then we also have abolition down here. And a lot of times when we're thinking about things that would improve the safety of folks in regards to policing, we are looking at what I think we think things like body cameras, for example, or community policing, or citizen oversight commission, things like that are going to improve police forces, but really they're increasing the legitimacy and the funding of police forces. So this framework really helped me because it actually goes through, and I won't go through necessarily one by one, but talking about what do these things actually do, and are they in line with defunding and moving toward a future that is not heavily relying on policing. And so body cameras, for example, it says increases the funding for police because we have to spend more money to give them new technologies, right? More training, again, will it reduce? No, it's going to add on a layer of funding to the police. Whereas if we scroll down a little bit, suspend the use of paid administrative leave for cops under investigation. We pay cops who are under investigation and put them on administrative leave. That is a continual drain on taxpayer dollars, when in reality it is we're continuing to pay someone who, in the case of Breonna Taylor, for example, are continuing to pay officers who have murdered someone, right? And so I think this framework, I don't necessarily want to go through everything one by one, but it was a really, really helpful resource for me to understand when I'm advocating for defunding the police, what does that look like, and why is that necessary? I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in. Kate, you also shared this with us, so maybe you have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think it's really great because it helps to contextualize a lot of the information that's kind of being shared in conversation about what does it look like to change the police. And there kinds of seems to be two real fractions, right? There's some people who are saying that we need to defund the police as a path to abolition, and there's other people who are saying, no, actually, we just need to change the police and reform them. And what can be confusing in the reform conversation is that a lot of the things that get sold to us as reform seem as though they're going to increase our sense of safety. But what we always need to be coming back to is that, one, all of the reform tactics have been tried and don't work. So the police have had lots of opportunity to reform. And even in many situations where crime has gone down, the way that the police are behaving hasn't changed. The rate at which they're killing people hasn't changed. And so when we're talking about defunding the police, I think it's really great for us to think about that, ultimately, we want to think about all of the responsibilities that the police currently have. Many of those responsibilities are wildly inappropriate for the police to have ever had. On average, only 1 to 4% of what the police do is respond to violent crime. And then a huge part of what they do are non-criminal calls, traffic, medical. And so when we're talking about defunding the police, we're thinking about looking at all of the stuff that the police do and thinking about if 1 to 4% of what they do is respond to violent crime, why are we paying the police an exorbitant amount of money to do things that other people can do better and in a way that's a lot it's overall provides a larger sense of real safety in our communities. So strict by just looking at what the police do, okay, and beginning to change the responsibilities and moving them over to appropriate people, we then begin to reduce the number of police in our communities. When we're talking about, so defund's number one, right? Then disarm. A huge amount of money goes to arming the police. And the police are armed more and more with things that only military should have, only people fighting in war, largely not on US soil against citizens. So there's a real legacy of the federal government working to get arms into local police departments, particularly police departments in cities that are sites of resistance. And Trump has worked to broaden this capacity. You can look at things like Urban Shield, and I shared, I'll share an article with you tonight about how Trump is working to get the police more arms. So again, there's no reason why the police should have military equipment, and a huge amount of their budget is going towards that. And then, you know, really when we're talking about disempowering the police, again, it goes back to the fewer and fewer responsibilities that they have, the fewer police that we need, and we're overall safer, moving towards cities where we actually have no police as we know them at all. But you know, we will need a very small, you know, like faction of people who can, you know, incapacitate a person who is armed and hurting people. But again, you know, maybe the police just need 1 to 4% of that budget for us to retrain other people to do that, because that's how much of the work it is.
It's interesting, we talk about needing cops to disarm violent people. The police officers that are in schools have not stopped one mass shooting.
Right.
I have friends who were attacked by a shooter in their home, and the cops waited until the gun violence or the ammunition stopped before they went into the building. Cops don't necessarily run and save people. And I think we have this like very misguided understanding that they go and help people when there's a violent situation happening. I mean, there are several instances that I'm aware of in my life, in the circles that I am in, that have seen the police just not even be willing to go in and help people, but like they're just going to wait it out. So, you know, when we talk about having them show up, like they're not going in and like fighting, you know, gunfighter. They're not having like gunfights with people who are already armed. Often the case is that they wait until the gunfire is stopped. So, and, you know, when we have cops in schools, and that obviously leads to the, you know, school to prison pipeline, they're there for the kids' safety. But I mean, you can look back at the caseloads and caseloads of mass shootings in high schools and even elementary schools. You can think about Sandy Hook, like cops did not save one of those little children's lives, even though they were present on school grounds. So, you know, people talk about like keeping us safe in these violent situations, and they often don't. And they often actually cause more death when they do show up, if they do decide to engage with people. You know, to Kate's point, you know, we need organizations and groups that de-escalate situations. We don't need cops going to like get cats out of trees, and we don't need cops going to like help a woman who's, you know, having a mental health crisis. You know, they're not trained for that. Most cops in the United States get 8 hours of mental health training, meaning they get 8 hours. They get one afternoon, one day of learning to understand the signs of somebody who maybe has dissociative personality disorder, or is bipolar, or has bipolar disorder, or, you know, like being able to differentiate those, or schizophrenia, like being able to differentiate those illnesses and understand how to approach somebody. Like, how are you supposed to learn that in 8 hours? You know, I have friends who are, you know, psychologists, and it's, you know, that's like a several year degree to fully understand these people's circumstances. So why would you just like show up with force in that space? There's an organization that I just heard about called Cahoots. It's in Eugene, Oregon. And I think it was started in the 70s because they were like, you know what, cops aren't helping people out. This isn't working. It was started by like a bunch of hippies, and they literally had like a van, and they would like show up when somebody was having a mental health crisis, and they've reduced the police brutality rate in Eugene by like 80%. And I'll link to their site. Sean King just did a great little podcast about them, but it basically is an example of, you know, what type of organizations need to start showing up in our cities to respond to so many calls that the cops show up to and then end up, you know, having a death, or, you know, oftentimes people call it a suicide by cop, but somebody will be having a mental health crisis and they will, you know, move too quickly and the cops will shoot them, that sort of thing. Like, there's so many different ways to do this, and there are examples all over the country that are, you know, people are starting to have fully funded functional groups that are doing this work. And you know what? They're saving the cities millions and millions of dollars, because all of the funding that used to go to police doesn't go to them anymore because they're not doing that work, you know. And Cahoots is actually like a pretty tightly run financial organization, and yeah, they've saved the city millions and millions of dollars. So there are ways for us to do this successfully. And while Eugene is only 160,000 people, it's a small city, and that might not translate immediately to a city like New York or Los Angeles. We have the opportunity to use that as an example and figure out how to expand and how to make it work for larger cities.
Yeah, and to that point, there are like crisis management systems and groups that do that in places like large cities like New York and Los Angeles, where, because this is not new. I think that that's one thing that I wanted to highlight, is that like there are groups that have been doing this, and many groups who understand and have understood, because historically cops have never been there to protect them, that there needs to be some other way to protect the community in place, like some other method in place. Sex workers, people who are from low-income backgrounds, Black and brown people, have figured out ways to maneuver and keep each other safe without dependence on police officers. Now this like concept of defunding the police, or really a call to stop relying on police, is coming into like the mainstream, and people are going, well, you know what, that's such a radical change. How are we going to do that? Who will keep us safe? And there are models for that. And like Anne was saying, in a lot of these places where the models exist, crime has actually gone down, because it truly like is kind of intuitive, right? Like if I was having a conflict with someone, right, and I wanted, I don't know, a third party mediator, someone who's not involved in the situation, to come in and like help me in that scenario, or help mediate that scenario, I probably wouldn't want someone who has no idea who I am, has no idea who the person I'm having a conflict with is, has no idea the context of our conflict, to come in, oh, and who's also armed, to come in and try to mediate that for me. What would make more sense is to have someone who can be unbiased but understands both parties involved in the context come and mediate that. And so that's sort of what these like crisis management systems groups that are across the country have done, is they understand the best people to reduce crime, the best people to intervene in crises are people who know the community, are the people living there. And so I actually had an article too that I wanted to share that talks about the different models, and gives the like really clear statistics on like how far crime has been reduced, the number of shootings that have been reduced in these places where these models exist and are being really successful, and operating with budgets that are like max like $250,000 when you compare. And this is in like Bed-Stuy, which is a neighborhood in New York, I think their budget was $228,000, and New York NYPD's budget is $6 billion. So people are doing this really successfully at the fraction of the cost. So I can link that as well down here.
Right. I mean, de-escalation isn't expensive. I worked in mental health for a really long time. I worked with people who had, chronic mental illness and addiction. I worked with psychotic people a lot of the time. And, I was never armed, and at any given time was in a house with 11 people with really serious mental illness, including, active psychosis and suicidality. And I can tell you that when I had someone who's really feeling unsafe and needed to go to the hospital, for sometimes up to 2 hours before I had to call the police for transport, I would have to spend my time like really preparing the person for what was going to happen when the police arrived, because I knew that I couldn't count on the police having any capacity at all to de-escalate the situation and to assure the person that they were going to feel safe while in custody between the residential program where I was working and the hospital. Also, there's lots of programs. I mean, here in Oakland, there's street medic programs, and I know there's street medic programs in Chicago, as well as mental health crisis de-escalation trainings that, like, any community member can take. And a large part of the cultural phenomenon that has justified the breadth of scope that the police have taken on is by teaching us that we're so disempowered and incapable of, showing up for each other in conflict, when people are going through or in mental health crisis. Largely, if more of us were trained, if there was more resources for the average person to know how to de-escalate a person, to know how to talk to a suicidal person, there's lots of things that we could solve on our own. And I think that there's also two things that I also want to talk about here, and things I hear a lot when people are talking about like why we can't de-escalate the police. And one of them comes from a place of believing that like punishment is a theory of change, as though like because people might be scared that they may be caught or might get in trouble, then they wouldn't commit crime. And it's a false argument. And when we really look at, the things that cause crime, largely the things that cause crime are inequity and lack of resources. So if we're really thinking strategically about what it means to eliminate violence in our communities, it means taking, like, what if all of us took real issue with the things that cause violence? Unemployment, poverty, also like there's also deeper things too. What does it look like for us to be really serious about a culture of consent, really serious about community-based models of accountability when people have caused harm and perpetrated sexual violence? Because right now, certainly, yes, some people do end up in prison, but most people who are engaging in violence in their communities are doing so in domestic spaces where they're never held accountable in any kind of way, because the only system that we have is a criminal system, which isn't actually a system of accountability. It's a system of punishment. But a lot of times people within people's communities protect them because they don't want to turn them over to a system of criminality for strictly punishment, but would be really useful for us if we had community accountable systems where we could frame accountability within our relationships, so that there were other ways of solving these issues and developing models so that people who had been harmed could be safe and kept safe by their community, and the people who had caused harm would be held accountable by their community to do the things that the person who was hurt was asking them to do, and on their terms and in ways that were actually meaningful. So a lot of this stuff is like really within, I love the way Angela Davis talks about abolition, because so often when we hear like defund the police or abolish, we just think like, oh, all of the conditions that exist right now will remain the same, only will be without the structures that we currently count on for security. And that's not true at all. The idea of abolition is for us to be thinking about what would it really look like for us to hold one another accountable in meaningful ways? What would it really look like for us to be dead serious about making sure that no one ever had to ever felt like they had to engage in violence, ever felt like that was their means of having control? So it's really, the framing of abolition should really be like a possibility politic and not one that's just about, eliminating something.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Kate, too, we talk about, people, I think people get really scared when they're like, oh, but like violent crimes and this and that. We have to also really recognize that police do a really horrible job of finding murderers and finding and convicting rapists. I think it was Minneapolis had like a 32% like conviction rate on homicides. Like, where is all that money going? Like, okay, so they're responding, but they're not actually able to like find people, right? Like the detectives aren't able to do their jobs or aren't doing their jobs well. And when it comes to sexual violence, I mean, the conviction rate for rapists is like 1%. Right. And to get them actually in court, you get like 5%. So like, like we can give cops all the money in the world, but if they're not actually getting anybody convicted because they're not doing their jobs, we're spending money to do what with, like there are better ways to solve these issues than just throwing our money at a system that's been literally designed to patrol slaves. That was the original intent of the police force hundreds of years ago. And it's obviously grown to a point where the police unions have so much power, right? Like a city council member in Minneapolis stated that they wanted to defund the police, and immediately the calls the calls made by that representative's constituents like went unanswered or slowly answered by the police force, like within like a day or two, right? So they're using their power and their leverage to manipulate and control politicians to not defund the police because they can. And so we really, I think, also need to look at like the bad practices that are within these systems. If you really need another reason to ask why we should defund police, it's because they're literally like using their power in like I don't know, it just feels very like organized crime, it just feels, oh, well, you're gonna like do this, well, we're gonna do this, and those people aren't gonna get the help that they need. We're not gonna do our jobs because we don't like your representative. Like, the manipulation kind of goes really far, and I think I have an article about police unions and how powerful they are, and how they're really doing everything they can to challenge any politicians who actually call for reform. So it's not just us being in the streets and protesting this, but it's also really about getting behind and supporting city council members, local representatives, state representatives around, how do we defund these folks and how do we move the money away from the systems that are in place that, there are several articles that discuss like overtime for cops and how much money they make with overtime. There was one prosecutor that was like, anytime I see a really ridiculous police report, that somebody's been like racked up with like 15 different crimes, I look and I see what time the police report was filed. And I can tell you that it's typically like right around when their shift's supposed to get off. But if they have to file a really long police report, they're going to be there for a couple of extra hours and get that overtime, and that adds up. One of the police officers that knocked down that old man in Buffalo, they were looking at his salary, and I think he made like $170,000 last year as a police officer, just working, like, obviously that is like a significant amount of overtime. So, if everybody's wondering where all this money is going, that is a good portion of it. It's also, going to buying demilitarized equipment from the federal government. So federal government's getting your taxpayer dollars to militarize the police as well.
Yeah, here in Oakland, they actually write into the budget a whole bunch of officer positions that they never hire. So they write into the budget salaries for people that they never plan on hiring, and then they use that money for overtime. There's officers here that have earned millions of dollars in overtime. I think another thing also locally when we're thinking about defunding and disempowering the police, something that's really important for us to understand are the ways in which what they call like quality of life crimes have been used to change the scope of how police have the capacity to have interface with the community. And so when we see things like, all the efforts that cities have made to make like graffiti serious crime. In San Francisco, it's illegal to sleep on sidewalks. All these like bullshit things that cities have done as part of broken windows policing, or like, it's this idea that like, oh, if they don't pay attention to the small things, then people in communities are going to do more serious crimes. And that psychology has been used to, in many ways, create ordinances that criminalize poverty. And so it creates opportunity for the police to like bother people or stop and frisk people. And a lot of times those things will escalate because they'll stop the person for something small, but then like maybe they'll find drugs on them, or maybe they'll just stop the person for something small and the person will be like, what are you doing? And then it escalates to a situation where then they charge the person with resisting arrest. So understanding the way those quality of life crimes operate in your city is really important when you're looking at what the police are actually doing and who they're actually arresting. In Ferguson, when they did the huge investigation, they saw that a huge part of what was happening in Ferguson was that the police were stopping all these people and putting them in jail and giving them fines knowing that they could never ever pay them. So all these people were stuck in jail on just like an accumulation of stupid late fees from like nothing crimes. And so it truly became like they were just sitting in jail and the crime was poverty, period. And so again, like when we think about really like, do we need the police to be doing, what could we be spending those police salaries on to actually address homelessness, to actually address addiction, to actually address poverty?
Yeah, there's so many ways we can do this differently.
I also like to think about how we define crime and what makes us define it that way. So I think oftentimes like local news sources or even mainstream news sources will kind of have headlines that read like, man in car doing drugs, basically, or something like that. And it's reading sort of like a police blotter, but it's in a headline. That's not a crime that's harming anyone, but it's kind of like we're kind of made to believe that it is. There's a really great podcast called Citations Needed that discusses the media, and they have this excellent podcast episode about the way that local news sources will take directly like only police reports and like fill them as crime reporting, and how we kind of take those things and like things like splashing mugshots all over the place when that person hasn't even gone through the court system yet. We don't even know if they're guilty of that crime. It not only one like totally decimates that person's reputation and character, but also now is providing us with, I guess, like this kind of like this repeated image of what somebody who commits crime looks like. And the crimes are always these like low level offenses, and street crimes is what they're called. But no one's ever really talking about policing white collar crimes, which arguably affect way more people than, low-level street crimes. And so I think that a lot of times if we have only had experiences with like our friendly neighborhood officer, right, we don't, our concept of crime and how much crime is actually, like how much harmful crime is actually out there is really kind of skewed by media and what we've been told crime looks like, and who does that benefit? That's a question like I asked repeatedly, like who does it benefit for us to believe that a certain type of person, like a person who commits crime has a certain look, and this is the type of crime that they commit. And so I can link that podcast as well. They do a really excellent job of talking about the media kind of being a mouthpiece for like crime reporting and like police propaganda in that way.
We do have a question, and if you guys have questions, please throw them in the Q&A. We have a question: is there a book you could recommend to solidify this revolution? I think the one that comes to mind immediately is, why am I not thinking of it? The End of Policing.
The End of Policing, yeah.
Which I've just linked in the chat. I think it's also, I think that's a free PDF, so you should be able to, maybe did it go through? No, it didn't. Hang on one second. But this book is kind of like I hate using the term the Bible for this conversation, but it really kind of breaks everything down as to sort of like how can we see this differently, and how can we move forward. I know we've had some questions in the past about like, so for example, Minneapolis, the city council like voted to disband the police force, but now they've decided to put it to a referendum and a vote, which is crazy because so many people are going to be uneducated about what it means and how you do it. And it needs to really be a specific conversation for each community, because it needs to respond specifically to the needs of the community, which are always going to be different depending on where you are and like what kind of crises the community is seeing. So I know it can sound like a really vague thing to just be like, yeah, we should defund the police and we should move money here and there. And this will take time. It's not something that just like happens like one day we have a police force and the next day we don't. Like we're going to need to build up all of these other organizations and figure out what works and what doesn't. And that's going to take some time to do well, right? But I think a lot of folks are just scared of the concept of just, disbanding the people that keep some people safe. But when it comes down to reality, like they're not keeping most people safe. And so we really need to consider like, how do we do that in a community that has this percentage of people under the poverty line, and this percentage of kids not graduating high school, and this percentage of the community without housing? Like how do you divert your resources to actually serve the needs of your community needs to be something that is very localized, but also really needs to center the people that have been abused by the police forces for so long, right? Like those are the people who don't have the resources they need, which is why the cops are always in their neighborhood. So we really need to recognize that this isn't something that like white folks can just be like, oh, we see that this needs to happen and this needs to happen, so we'll do that and it'll work. No, this needs to center the communities that have been abused for generations by the cops, because they know what they need and they're the ones who are being over-policed. So I know it's sort of an abstract conversation because it's, how do you know how much money to put where? But it really comes down to, city budgets and understanding specifically what each city or municipality needs.
I mean, I think it's also something we know what well-resourced communities look like. Many of us live in them. So to also kind of like move to this place where like, well, what would we do and how would it be like, is also, I think, it reflects a lot of the kind of paternal approach that white people have towards communities that are suffering from poverty. We're like, you know, in the same way that, you know, well-resourced white communities make decisions about how much money is needed for X number of kids to make sure that they all go to college, communities that have been operating without what they need for a long time, A, they know how to do a hell of a lot more with money than we will ever know how to do with money because they've been doing it for a really long time. And B, they understand the anatomy of the problems within their communities. And so they should absolutely be leading what it looks like to reallocate money. And I would argue that, and we should be also, you know, this should be a conversation that considers, and what does it look like within this reallocation of money to think about like reparations for the harm that's been caused in communities by over policing. You know, policing is really the front line of the prison industrial system and tremendous trauma. So, you know, this isn't just specifically about just like the ins and outs of just like everyday policing, but the policing are the front, you know, they're like really the front door to a system that eliminates so many people from their communities for many, 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 many years. And we need to understand that all of this is very connected. And it's connected to, you know, policing has always been designed to defend white property owners. You know, like its intrinsic connection to capitalism and whiteness, like they have been married from the very, very beginning. So there's no way to talk about this in a way that is deracialized or isn't connected to the prison industrial complex.
And on that note, I did want to suggest that Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis is another good book for the person who asked for a book that talks about the prison industrial complex as a whole. And as Kate mentioned, policing is like the front line of that, but there are so many things that happen after like police interaction, and defunding police is a step toward abolition for that entire system. So I think that like when we're talking about this, we're talking about like one arm and one component, but it needs to be understood that that's an approach and a step toward abolition with abolition as an end goal. It's not the only thing that we're gonna do. I did wanna, we have 3 questions and like 15 minutes left. I'll read this one. I think it's really great. Suggestions on how to open the conversation to people who interpret defund and abolish police quite literally.
Well, I think it starts with recognizing and maybe discussing, like, we realize that these communities aren't getting the needs met, right? And like much to what Kate was just saying of like, we know what well-funded communities look like. And maybe starting there and recognizing like, okay, like we know that we need to put more funding towards X, Y, and Z. Like we know that the cops are responding to X, Y, and Z, but failing to do so. So siphoning some of the money from them and placing it into organizations whose sole purpose is to focus on homelessness outreach or food insecurity, or, you know, pick a topic, there's dozens of them. And sort of shift that conversation into a way of, you know, kind of discussing like, well, these needs aren't being met, but this is the organization, the police or the organization that are, you know, told that they have to deal with it. And maybe start there and just, you know, say like, it's not like it's not black and white, it's not cut and dry, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it is going to be shifting resources.
I really appreciate the most recent question that we got that says, what do you think the challenges and differences are between defunding in big cities and defunding in the surrounding suburbs? What can we do in more white suburban areas to help the cause? The police in the whiter suburbs still target and harass POC driving through or working in these cities. What can we do to stop that? Okay, there's a couple things here that I think are really important. One thing that I think is really important for people to be talking about in white suburbs in this conversation is that you're not actually policed that much. So I think that in these conversations about like defunding the police, a lot of the people who I hear talking about that we need the police so much are the people who live in communities who are the least policed, right? So if you live in a white suburb, it's likely that you go days without ever seeing the police. You never stopped for no reason. You never had your kids in your front yard being harassed by the cops for no reason. You never have your kids getting stopped and frisked just like for playing in public, okay? And so I think one thing is like a clear understanding of that and taking real ownership of that, and seeing the difference between the way you experience policing versus the way Black, Indigenous, and people, like communities of color, are experiencing policing. So there's one thing, it's like we need to own that distinction. Secondly, I think it's super important that in those communities, like for example, I grew up in central Massachusetts, really small town. And recently the superintendent of schools at the high school at the school district that I went to, he first put out a letter like affirming, you know, that like Black Lives Matter and that they really stand like in solidarity with those who love George Floyd, this, that, and another thing. And then the next week, the guy puts out a letter talking about how, and also we really respect our police department. Like they've helped us in these XYZ ways. And like when we're talking about like, you know, police who are disrespectful or harmful, those are our police. And this is the problem. It's that our belief in those police are why the police exist. So we need to also really understand our role in that. Again, the way we experience policing is very different than how you experience policing if you live in a non-white body. And so those of us who live in white bodies who have cheery, respectful relationships with our police, we need to take issue with that and see the way that like we're holding the institution of policing together. So this comes back to like, there's no good cops. In the same way that we need to understand all of the racist contours of policing, we need to understand the racist contours of policing in our communities and talk about how it is that because we feel safe and we're using the system, we're maintaining the system that's getting other people killed. So we have to start from scratch and we have to defund everywhere and build something that isn't harmful to anyone everywhere. So yes, the cops in your community, when they have access to people, to Black and brown bodies, right, they are targeting them. And so you can be sure that your police department isn't different from any other police department, and that like it's not corruptive racism, it's rich with racism, because look, even when Black and brown people drive through your town, they stop them. And it's funny, actually, I wrote a letter to the superintendent of schools where I went to high school, and I said, I know that probably the only time you see the police being racist in your community is when they profile people driving through. But, so I think that those two things are really important. So I think it's a conversation that really is about looking at ourselves and seeing our part in maintaining this system that's incredibly harmful, even when it doesn't seem harmful in the places where we're spending time.
So Kristen asked a question. Do you think we need healthcare, housing, and childcare before we can abolish the police? Care, not cops. How do we get this to happen?
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
all of these things need to be stabilized before, like, I guess I don't want to say before. I think like in conjunction, like we need to feel safe and secure and supported and have like basic needs met, in order to see a world that has significantly reduced police force or no police and no prisons be successful in the first place. We don't get to have one without the other. So yes.
And I think also, it's also important to note that right now we have violence and insecurity because of the police, and violence and insecurity because we don't have healthcare, housing, and childcare. You know, so I think also it's one of these things where it's not as though the police are serving some, like the police aren't doing any great job with healthcare, housing, and childcare. And so I would say that I'm not necessarily sure that one has to be like resolve one or the other. I would say that if we had healthcare, housing, and childcare, immediately we would have a lot fewer reasons for the police in our communities.
Yeah, and I think that gets tough too, right? Because in cities like New York, where like the budgets are just so insane, and where does all of that money go?
Mm-hmm.
And there's just literally not enough space to make more housing. Like, you know, you're at a max, but yet there's so many people, and it's like you have to have like the cities can't just like, we have so many problems in our cities, and you can't just blame the cops for all of them. Like, sure, they show up and they fuck a bunch of shit up that they shouldn't even be part of, but like, you know, the reason that they're being called is because people don't have secure housing, or people don't have jobs that can like supply their family with enough to eat. Like, we have a very significant greater problem, which is capitalism in a society that, you know, is incredibly unequal. And so you have to figure out, like, how do you find budget money in a city like New York for affordable housing? How do you find money to actually solve it? Not to just say like, hey, we're going to build a bunch of affordable apartments in like 2035, which is basically what they did a few years ago. And it was like,
I have a few ideas. One would be, you know, if we weren't using tax dollars to pay out families that the cops killed, we have a bunch more millions there. If we weren't paying cops on paid leave, we had a lot more million there. If we weren't letting the police department buy military equipment to use against us at protests, we got some money there. So yeah, so these things are really.
Yeah, if you didn't have to pay families who were, you know, had a family member killed by a police officer, you'd have a bunch of money there. Because if the cops aren't killing people, then there's no suits against them for that. I can't remember the number.
The cops themselves were individually responsible.
Yeah, well, then there would be no cops either, which might be great. Nobody's going to be a cop if they can't be supported by their unions in the city. But yeah, I mean, so to Eden's point, it really has to happen in conjunction with one another. But it's, you know, these are really, really big problems in big cities. I think it's much more manageable in small cities, but you just have, you know, you really have to find the money, and that's going to have to come out of the police budgets, because all the other social services are being destroyed by, you know.
But also when you look at the police budget, it is wild. It's like looking at military budgets where you're like, oh, schools get $10 and police get 700 million. You know, it's kind of wild, the disproportionate numbers. I mean, it feels like monopoly money when you start really looking at police budget. Billions. Like in New York, they were fighting to cut $1 billion out of the budget.
And they only got 150 million, which was like nothing. And then they moved the school officers for the schools into the Department of Education. So they didn't actually, they cut a bunch of the police budget, but it was literally, they just moved the numbers around. I know Kristen talked about that at some point, but you know, she asked a question about it, and that's exactly what they did. They just like pretended that they cut a bunch of money, but they just moved it to a different part of the budget. It's just total bullshit. And so everybody has every right to be out protesting every single fucking day until this changes. So I hope all of you are doing that. Or, you know, doing something else. Like coming to our videos. We do want to ask you guys for whatever you want to, if you guys have questions about other topics that you'd like us to explore for next week, please throw that in the chat.
I know last week a lot of people were asking about capitalism, like capitalism and abolition, or capitalism and white supremacy, the delusion of white supremacy. We're working on this. As a team, we decided we're no longer saying white supremacy because obviously it's not a real thing. So we're going to be naming it the delusion of white supremacy, which is hard for me. Everyone else on board uses it more often. It's more used to saying it. For me, I like saying white supremacy because I think it makes white people go, ah, I really need to like do some shit, but I'm not part of that. But I also agree that I don't want to be putting that into like the lexicon of language you're used to. So the delusion of white supremacy and capitalism. It was something you guys talked about last week. But yeah, tell us topics you're interested in.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll default to capitalism and its interaction with all of this, which I think is a very broad topic, so we might have to narrow it further. But
yeah, can the work be done within a capitalist country system? Good question.
Ooh, how to be more helpful in defending the Native communities in this country?
Another great question. Give